Hey everybody, it's me, Peter, and I am a huge movie buff. And as a huge movie buff, something that I hear very often is I don't like silent films. Now, usually people don't want to watch a silent film because they don't want to have to read during their movies. Which is fair, I guess. You don't want to have to put that extra focus into a movie to actually be reading it while you're watching it. It's just like a movie with subtitles, right? But before you give up on silent films completely, you're not going to be doing as much reading as you think. At the height of the silent era, it was pretty well understood by all of the best filmmakers that cinema was the art of visual storytelling. The idea was to be able to communicate the story to the audience as clearly as possible while using the least amount of title cards. For the most part, they considered the best films the ones that would only use title cards when absolutely necessary. And so there isn't really that much reading in silent films. They didn't use a lot of title cards because the way that they were shot, they didn't need a lot of title cards.
We didn't need dialogue. We had faces.
That being said, when I do these videos, usually I talk about how influential some of the films are, no matter what genre it is. But it's rare that I ever pick an influential film as a suggestion to somebody who doesn't like a specific type of movie. And the silent era is no exception. It was at the infancy of cinema, so if a film in the silent era is considered influential, usually it's because it did something for the first time. Something that, by today's standards, would be considered pretty simple. So there are a lot of movies that I would suggest for the film student, or somebody who wants to know about the history of film. To them, I would suggest 1902's A Trip to the Moon, which, if you've never heard of it, you've probably at least seen the iconic image of the rocket in the eye of the moon. A Trip to the Moon is considered one of the first films to have a narrative, a beginning, middle, and an end. And then the following year, in 1903, The Great Train Robbery came out. And The Great Train Robbery was one of the first films to use what is known as parallel editing. See, most films at the time were shot like a play. Every single scene was shot on a single set, and then the next scene would take place on a different set. But in The Great Train Robbery, parallel editing is what allowed them to shoot two different scenes and then edit them together, intertwining them, so that you could tell that these two things in these two different locations were actually happening at the same time. So this was one of the first steps in having films separate from the way that a play would be performed. But this is just the early 1900s, so we'll have to skip ahead a little bit to the 1910s. You can't talk about the silent era without at least mentioning D.W. Griffith. D.W. Griffith is credited as being the godfather of film. Just to give you an idea of why he's considered the godfather of film, he actually popularized a lot of different things. He popularized the feature-length film, mass distribution of a film. He was one of the original 4 founders of United Artists, as well as one of the founders of the Academy Awards. But perhaps most importantly, he popularized what is today known as film grammar. Back then it was pretty simple: shot, reverse shot, or showing an establishing shot and then following it up with a close-up. Like I said, up to this point, films were, for the most part, shot the same way a play would be performed. You could see the actors from head to toe, and the camera would rarely, if ever, move. But D.W. Griffith understood that the audience would be able to fill in the blanks. He could show an establishing shot, where you could see all the performers, and then he would show a close-up of one of those performers. So like I said, pretty basic stuff, but it's also the basis for what our entire cinematic language is today. He started telling stories the way that you should in a movie, as opposed to the way that you should in a play. And for the film student, if you were going to watch some of D.W. Griffith's movies, I would recommend The Birth of a Nation or Intolerance. But I wouldn't recommend these movies to the casual viewer for a number of reasons. The Birth of a Nation is considered a masterpiece in its own right, but it's also quite controversial. The second half of the movie was based off of a book called The Klansman, and The Klansman portrays the KKK as the heroes, and the movie remains faithful to the source material. As you can imagine, this caused quite a stir, and he was criticized heavily for making this film. Something that was actually not as well known about D.W. Griffith is that he would often make movies that contradicted each other. And prior to The Birth of a Nation, he did make a movie that showed the KKK as villains. In terms of his opinions or his political beliefs, they were actually quite a mystery to the public because he would always have conflicting films. He liked to film things from both points of view. But that didn't prevent him from being criticized for making this film. And so, in a response to his critics, he made Intolerance the following year. Intolerance shows the effects of 4 intolerable events in 4 different timelines. It's more of a statement on human nature as a whole, and the message is obviously a lot better than the one that was shown in The Birth of a Nation. But I still wouldn't recommend this one to the casual viewer because, like Birth of a Nation, it's about 3 hours long. A 3-hour long silent film is kind of hard to get through. But we're still only in the 1910s. Really, where silent films started to shine was in the next decade, the 1920s. And again, for the film student or the film historian, I could talk about German expressionism. Movies like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which used set pieces and lighting as a way of conveying emotion. These expressionist techniques became very apparent in the noir genre. Filmmakers like Billy Wilder was known for having kind of an expressionist feel to all of his films. Or I could talk about French surrealism, movies like Un Chien Andalou, which is kind of like the cinematic equivalent of interpretive dance. They show random, interesting images as a way of kind of making you feel a certain way, but they're not really trying to tell a story. Then I could also talk about some of the great dramas and silent films. The Hunchback of Notre Dame stands out to me. Or some of the amazing horror films from the silent era, like Nosferatu or The Phantom of the Opera. And then there's some really fun action movies, too. All the Douglas Fairbanks movies. The Thief of Baghdad, The Black Pirate, The Mark of Zorro. And while all of these movies are very good, while all of these movies are something that I might recommend to a film student or somebody who's studying film, I don't think that any of them are one that I would suggest or recommend to someone who doesn't like silent movies. And the main reason is that the pacing was still a little bit off. This was still at the beginning of cinema, and we were still kind of trying to find what worked best. In the dramas and the horror films and the surrealistic films and the expressionistic films, the pacing can drag a little bit. I can imagine a modern viewer becoming very impatient with a number of these films. But really, where silent films shine is in the comedy genre. The comedy films in the silent era had similar pacing to what today's films are like, and the length of the entire movie is pretty similar to the length of modern day comedies. A lot of the horror films, the dramas, the D.W. Griffith films, they could be 2.5 to 3 hours long. But if you watch a comedy, it's about an hour 20 minutes, hour 30 minutes. And while Fatty Arbuckle and Laurel and Hardy were very funny, while I feel very comfortable picking Harold Lloyd's Safety Last, when it comes to comedy in the silent era, there's really only two names that you need to know: Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. But I'm going to take it a step further. 1927 is the year that The Jazz Singer came out. The Jazz Singer was credited as being the first film to have synchronized sound and talking. The Jazz Singer was such a commercial success that it actually started to popularize talking pictures. They called them talkies. And by the time 1930, 1931 came around, talking picture was pretty much the norm, and silent films had kind of faded into obscurity. But I would go so far as to say that the best silent films that Buster Keaton made were in the 1920s before talking pictures came out. And I would be so bold as to say that the best Charlie Chaplin films were the ones that came out in the 1930s, after the talking pictures became the norm. And taking it a step further, I would feel comfortable suggesting any movie made by either one of these masters. And for those reasons, I'm actually going to pick two movies. One Buster Keaton movie, and one Charlie Chaplin movie. For Buster Keaton in the 1920s, while I would feel very comfortable picking The Navigator or Sherlock Jr., for me, there's really no competition. I have to pick The General. The General was a 1927 film written and directed by Clyde Bruckman and Buster Keaton. When I first started getting into studying film, The General was one of the films that I saw very early on. For years and years, I continued to say that The General and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World were the two funniest movies ever made. There are so many unforgettable scenes in this movie, so many scenes that just leave you in stitches, and it's worth noting that there is a bridge collapse scene in this movie that stands as the most expensive scene ever filmed in a silent film. And on top of that, all of these scenes were actually Buster Keaton running around atop a moving train. Buster Keaton was known for doing dangerous things, and would often do death-defying stunts in his films. In fact, his nickname Buster came from when he worked in vaudeville as a child. It was a slapstick bit, and his father would often throw him around, throw him across the stage, and he would just know how to roll with the punches and not get hurt. After you've seen a number of Buster Keaton's movies, you start to think that he might be a little bit inhuman. He was incredibly strong for somebody his size, and even fractured his neck in one of his films. He continued to work for decades afterwards, never realizing that he actually had a fracture in his neck. And for Charlie Chaplin, while movies like The Gold Rush or The Kid are great films, and in the 1930s, Modern Times is an amazing movie, for me, one of the greatest films of all time, silent or not, is 1931's City Lights. City Lights was written and directed by Charlie Chaplin. In 1931, the year that this movie came out, was the same year that famous talkies like Public Enemy, Dracula, and Frankenstein came out. It's worth knowing that before you go into this film, because Charlie Chaplin actually makes fun of the sound quality in talking pictures at the beginning of City Lights. to this day, I consider this film one of the best films ever made, easily in the top 5. As the little tramp, Charlie Chaplin does everything in his power to help a poor blind woman. And the blind woman thinks that he's rich, so she doesn't realize all the hoops that he has to jump through. It's a brilliantly told love story. It's incredibly hilarious, and it's one of the most heartwarming romances I've ever seen on film. So if you don't like silent films, then I suggest you give The General and City Lights a chance. Then get back to me in the comments and let me know what you thought of them. And if you enjoyed my video, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.